What does Paul really mean when he says a Jew is one inwardly and circumcision is a matter of the heart in Romans chapter 2? Well, for centuries, this verse, Romans 2:29, has been interpreted to mean that Christians are now the real Jews or spiritual Jews or true Jews. In other words, this text has been understood as Paul promoting the idea that outward, physical Jewish identity has been replaced by something inward and spiritual, which is now applied to the church. But what if that reading isn't what Paul meant at all? Well, let's take a look at this. First, let's zoom out and keep in mind that Paul tells us in Romans chapter 1 that he's writing to a group of Gentile Christ followers in Rome. And from what we can gather, Paul is responding to a troubling report that led him to believe that some Christians in Rome were drawing unhealthy conclusions about their standing in God's family. And this identity confusion among these Gentile Christ followers, it led to a problem that concerned Paul greatly. These early Christians were developing an arrogant posture toward the Jewish community. Starting in Romans 2, Paul goes after that arrogance. Ironically, though, most commentators believe Paul is addressing Jewish arrogance in Romans 2. However, I agree with a growing number of excellent scholars such as Matthew Thiessen, Matthew Novenson, and Rafael Rodriguez that it's more likely that Paul is confronting Gentile arrogance in Romans 2 and not Jewish arrogance. Again, Paul tells us 4 times in Romans that he's addressing this letter to Gentile Christ followers. So as Paul dials his focus in Romans 2, he confronts certain kinds of Gentiles who were misguided about their identity, and they're misguided about how to join and flourish within God's family. So when we get to Romans 2:17, Paul introduces a character who calls himself a Jew and relies on the law. Now again, most commentators assume Paul is addressing a hypothetical Jewish character here who represents a very typical self-righteous Jew. But think about it. Why would Paul refer to this character as a person who calls themselves a Jew if they really were one? Paul's wording suggests doubt and maybe even some sarcasm. And that's because Paul isn't addressing a character who represents Jewish people or Jewish sins. Rather, Paul is confronting a hypothetical Gentile who considers himself Jewish because he's been circumcised and has assumed a Jewish identity. But Paul's not impressed, and he's not convinced. This so-called Jew boasts in the law and claims to be a guide to the blind. But according to Paul, this Gentile is misleading himself and other Gentiles. This character who calls himself a Jew thinks circumcision afforded him a legitimate status in God's family. But something that Paul was passionate about guarding is the idea that it's only through Christ and the Spirit that Gentiles can be sons and daughters of God. And that brings us to Romans chapter 2, verses 28 and 29, in which Paul gets to the heart of the issue. He writes, "For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, but a Jew is one inwardly. Circumcision is a matter of the heart by the Spirit." Now, many Bible teachers present this verse as Paul's new definition of what it means to be a Jew. In other words, it is very common. I'm sure you've heard this, but it's very common for Bible teachers to use this text to argue that if you have Christ and you have the Spirit inside you, you are now a true spiritual Jew, whether you were born Jewish or not. And on the flip side, Bible teachers often use this text to argue that Jews who don't believe in Christ are not real Jews. But here's the thing. Paul isn't redefining what it means to be Jewish in Romans 2:28 and 29. And he's not saying Christians are the real or spiritual Jews. In this text, Paul is describing the discreet, quiet, humble posture of a legitimate Jewish person who doesn't need to arrogantly display who they are. In other words, Paul is simply stating what a real Jew is like, in contrast to the flawed assumptions of this so-called Jew who is most likely a misguided and pretentious Gentile who is misappropriating Jewish identity. Now, why does this matter? Well, sadly, Romans 2 has been mostly read as an indication of Paul's so-called departure from Judaism. But just as Paul was suspicious of the claims of the so-called Jew in Romans 2, we should be suspicious of readings of this text that present Paul as redefining fundamental Jewish concepts such as who is a Jew and what circumcision is. Here's the thing. In Romans 2, Paul is correcting what he perceives to be improper expressions of identity for Gentiles who are related to the Christ movement. Paul writes this letter to help Gentiles form a healthy in Christ identity with the hope that this will also result in a healthy and positive relationship with the Jewish community. And I'm persuaded that by reframing Romans 2 in this way, it not only helps us get closer to Paul's original intentions, this reading also challenges standard interpretations which position Paul outside of or against Judaism. Hey, if you'd like to learn more about Paul and his Jewish and Greco-Roman context, check out my book, The Weird Apostle. You can find it on Amazon. And don't miss out on any of my new content by subscribing wherever you're watching or listening. If you'd like to learn more about how to build bridges between Jews and Christians, check out bridgebuildersforum.com.